I'm one of 4 sisters, no brother, but before I was born, there was a boy, but he died very young. My father never forgot, and he always considered that to be his misfortune, that he did not have any sons in the family who could continue our family name. I was a real tomboy. I liked to climb up on the trees. I wanted to jump over a little stream boys used to do. I wanted to do the same. As far as I'm concerned, it was a mistake that I came to this world as a girl anyway.
1950, as communism encircles Eastern Europe and nationalist movements become more violent, escape to the West is for many the only option. Australia opens its doors to people from many parts of the globe, but the White Australia policy still guards the gate to non-white immigration on any scale, and discrimination is everywhere apparent. For many, all that remains of their homeland is contained in a suitcase. By the end of the Second World War in 1945, a proud Japan had been brought to its knees. During the post-war occupation by the Allies, many Japanese women fell in love with Australian soldiers. Hideko Coombes was one of them, a young, respectable Japanese girl. A chance meeting led to a marriage that would take her to a new life in Australia. It was a love story between 2 opposing cultures that was to last a lifetime.
To be a dutiful Japanese daughter meant, to start with, you're expected to obey the parents, particularly father, who is the head of the family. My family was a very strict one. Particularly my father was typical, respectable Japanese man. He was interested in Japanese martial arts, Japanese music. There was no trace of Western culture in our family. My mother was a very gentle, typical Japanese woman who worked very hard. She worked all the time. And she never complained. She never answered my father back. In lots of ways, my father was, well, you might say, tyrant too. He was the boss. At about the time when I went to high school, that was the time Japan got involved with the war with America. And that was around the time we started to experience hardship, such as things became quite scarce. And then later on, food rations started. Everything was rationed. And the propaganda war was very fierce. We were prepared to endure any hardship in order to protect our country. So if Japan was invaded, we were even told to commit suicide rather than be captured. And if we had to come face to face with enemies, well, what sort of weapons could we use? They even told us to cut bamboo stick, and cut the top very sharply, and to use it as a spear to fight against the enemy, which was, we knew it was quite ridiculous thought, but we had no freedom of speech, so nobody spoke up. Only about a month before the end of the war, Kure was bombed. We lost our house, and overnight, we lost everything. The firebomb was dropped right on top of our head, And when I realized my clothes were on fire, so was my mother's. So we jumped into the big water tank, but that wasn't very safe either because fire was floating on top of the water tank too. So we had to jump out of there. And I noticed my sister, who didn't jump into the water tank, was jumping around, is avoiding the fire on the road. I was not all that scared at that time, but after, delayed shock was terrible. I was scared to death about it. One morning, about 3 weeks later, we were doing washing or something, I can't remember, but we saw this terrific flash of light. It was as blue as you could imagine, and the light was very, very strong, well, much bigger than the biggest lightning I had ever experienced. Then, quite a few minutes later, we had this great big sound of huge bomb or something exploded. Then suddenly we discovered over our head huge cloud. But this cloud was also nothing we had seen in the past. This cloud was growing bigger and bigger and bigger right on top of our head, and that stayed there for quite a few days. So people started to talk about this flash and the huge sound of explosion as pika, that's for the flash, don, that was the explosion, picadon, that was the onomatopoeia of what we later found out to be atomic bomb. Atomic bomb, nobody had ever heard of that. We wanted to find out what had happened to Hiroshima. We asked, but nobody told us. It was such terrible scene that they saw and experienced such horrific things. They just said, no, women and children did not have to find out. I was shocked with the ignorance of someone like myself who lived not far from Hiroshima, and I spent quite a lot of time there, but I still did not know detailed account of what happened to each individual. Soon after Hiroshima, Nagasaki was bombed as well, and naturally we thought, where would be the next? The emperor, who was supposed to be the god, such a remote person to us, made very important speech on the radio. And he told us all, Japanese, that this was the end of the war. We must stop fighting, and we must start building Japan in a very peaceful world. If he did not talk to us on the radio, yes, many people would have committed suicide or killed each other. And from that time, of course, Japan started to change very, very rapidly. Without Japanese people fighting, we were given democracy. And I think that probably built the foundation of New Japan today. And also, we women were given equality. That was a big news for me, and not only myself, but lots of other people too. After the war, I went to have a job interview at the British Commonwealth Forces. The employment officer was an Australian sergeant. I was prepared to use my English, however poor it was, but I couldn't believe my ears. What I heard was Japanese, spoken by this Australian sergeant. I got such a shock. I thought, just a minute. His Japanese is much better than my English. I was shocked and quite intimidated. And I thought to myself, where did he learn Japanese? But anyway, despite my poor English, I did get a job. And I started to work, doing very simple translation and this and that. But anyway, one day after work, I was ready to go and meet up with my old school friend. But it started to rain, and I didn't know what to do. I was just waiting outside the office, hoping that the rain would stop. And then who came along? That was this Australian soldier, and he offered me a lift. That was the first real encounter with my future husband. And since that time, we started to meet up after work, and then because he could speak Japanese, he started to visit my family. So gradually, we got to know each other. He was the first person who treated me as his equal, not the man from the country that conquered us. And also, he kept telling me, don't denigrate yourself because your country lost the war. You are building up your country and you have your equality with men too. You just have to change your way of thought. You assert yourself. And, well, that was something I liked to hear very, very much. I suppose I was strongly drawn into him and his way of thought. Now, my father had his traditional ideas of whom I had to marry. Of course, Japanese marriage is not for each individual, but it is primarily for the family, and your individual happiness comes second place. My father naturally wanted me to marry respectable Japanese man with background similar to my respectable family. Of course, Australian did not come into his thought at all. He thought, well, he didn't even think that I was contemplating such outrageous thing at all. But as my husband and I got to know each other more and more, well, we started to think about marriage. I explained to my future husband that time that my idea was very untraditional, and naturally I was going to hurt my father's feelings so much. So, according to the tradition, we decided to use a go-between, nakodo, in Japanese. So those went to propose marriage to my father. My father was very diplomatic that time. He did not raise any objection. He did not raise his voice very much either. In fact, he was very calm. And his answer was that he will think about it. So those people all thought, oh, the meeting went very well. We succeeded. But the next day when I went home, I was detained at home from that day. I was not even allowed to go to work. So he wanted me to cut my relationship with my future husband completely. But we were much more cunning than that. Meanwhile, my husband went to make arrangement for the legal marriage. That was the registration at the Kure City Hall. And prior to that, my husband told me to get the belonging together and come out. I still thought that day I could come home, but my husband and people said, once you went home, that was really the end of it. And my husband told me to ring my father and tell him or inform him of legal marriage. My father said, all right, come home. He said, come home. Doesn't matter what it was, just come home. I was prepared to go home, but as I said, well, if you went home, that's the end of it. You'll never be able to get out of your house. So, that's what happened. I asked my husband if he could possibly make his life in Japan, but he thought it was very difficult indeed. To start with, what was he going to do in Japan? He needed capital. He didn't have that. He had a bit of saving, but not very much. Besides, I think he really wanted to come back to Australia. Well, I was still old-fashioned in lots of ways, and I thought, well, I had to follow my husband. In the corner of my mind, I felt, of course, Australia might give me completely new life. So there was a bit of a sense of adventure for me too. At first, when my husband informed his father that he had married a Japanese woman and he was going to bring his Japanese wife to Australia, my father-in-law was not pleased at all. He didn't want Japanese girl brought to Australia. Well, that was only natural, I think. But anyway, my husband suggested that I would correspond with my father-in-law. So I started to write him talking about my family. It was very important that he knew I was from a very respectable family, and I wasn't a gold digger or a harlot. And I explained my education and my interest, or my hobbies and interest in my life too. And surprisingly, after about 2 letters, his attitude changed, and he accepted me. I thought that was quite amazing. And apparently quite a few old friends of my husband's and the neighbors and the people chastised my husband for bringing Japanese wife. And who was the one to stand up and defended my husband? It was my father-in-law. I was quite amazed. The day I left Korea by train, whole family came to send me off. And that day, my father said to me, if my marriage did not work out, I could go back to Japan. Well, I thought that was the word of acceptance from my father. And I felt I might not be able to see my family again. I might not be able to come back to Japan again. If my marriage broke out, how dare I could go back to Japan? So I had to make my marriage successful no matter what, I thought. On 23rd of September 1953, I arrived in Australia. And I thought the impression of Sydney Harbour was absolutely picturesque. Our ship was berthed at Uluru. From there we could see botanic gardens. And then behind the botanical gardens, there were beautiful statuesque buildings. I thought they looked very dignified, but very quiet place. And after a while, my husband spotted his family, car full of the family waiting, and I was quite moved. I know they came to see my husband, but I was with him too. And I thought, if they did not approve of my husband bringing a Japanese wife, they did not have to be there. So I was very pleased. They did not altogether disapprove of my coming here. Australia gave me freedom. I did not have to really worry about unwritten laws of Japan. Well, I think there's a huge merit for being dutiful and obedient daughter too, but at the same time, I do not have to think the same way as my father or my husband. I can have the thought of my own. I'm a widow now, so I have total freedom, so to speak, but even if I was still married, I can still assert myself. But nearly 50 years ago in Japan, no, I don't think I could. broke all the tradition. Well, marry Australian to come to Australia and all that sort of things. That was unheard of those days. But that's the strength of love. And it's a madness.